PMQs, Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley.
And Patrick Maguire. Tim Shipman is still off. Who knows where? Maybe he's having some redecoration.
Well, he's probably doing the wallpaper, I think. Explains how good his access is.
Patrick Maguire, only really one issue that's going to come up at PMQs today.
Yeah, look, I don't think Carrie Symonds is going to get re-elected, is the long and short of this row. It's interesting because often the days when you speak to anyone who prepares for PMQs, who has prepared to lead with the opposition for PMQs, and often they'll say that the trickiest sessions to get the better of the Prime Minister are the ones where you assume there's a huge open goal in front of you, because everybody from the lobby to your own backbenchers to number 10 will have been preparing the same questions in their head. So it'd be very interesting. And also it'd be interesting to see if Keir Starmer takes up the mantle of the Electoral Commission or he returns to some of the Dominic Cummings testimony early in the week. I imagine we'll have a bit of both.
Probably a bit of both. Everyone seems to think that he'll probably go on the flat. Although we've had a message from Nigel in Brecon. He says, don't you think Keir Starmer has more to gain by questioning Boris on his alleged comments on bodies piling up in the street and subsequent denial rather than focusing entirely on the Downing Street flat? Well, we can find out now. Let's go live to the House of Commons. Quick off. Question number 1 from Labour leader Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his remarks about the humanitarian disaster we're witnessing in India? I know the UK has already committed some support, but given the scale and gravity of the disaster, I hope the Foreign Secretary will set out today what more the UK will do to help the Indian people in their hour of need. Can I also join the Prime Minister in his remarks about the Post Office case and ongoing injustice? And of course, today is International Workers' Memorial Day, and this day, this year, after all the sacrifices our frontline workers have made during the pandemic, it's even more poignant than usual. I join in solidarity with all those mourning loved ones today. Mr. Speaker, it was reported this week, including in the Daily Mail, the BBC and ITV, backed up by numerous sources, that at the end of October the Prime Minister said he would rather have, and I quote, bodies pile high than implement another lockdown. Can the Prime Minister tell the House categorically,
Boris Johnson's
yes
shaking
or
his
no,
head in the House of Commons there.
Did he make those remarks or remarks to that effect?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, and I think the right honourable gentleman is a lawyer, I'm given to understand. I think that if he's going to repeat allegations like that, he should come to this House and substantiate those allegations and say where he heard them and who exactly is supposed to have said those. Who exactly is supposed to have said those things, Mr. Speaker? Because what I certainly can tell him, and he asked about the October decisions, they were very bitter, very difficult decisions, as they would be for any Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, because no one wants to put this country into a lockdown with all the consequences that means for loss of education, for the damage to people's life chances, to the huge medical backlog that it entails. But it was thanks to that lockdown, the tough decision that we took, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the heroic efforts of the British people, that we have got through to this stage in the pandemic where we find ourselves rolling out our vaccine, where we've done 50% of the population, 25% of the adult population have now had 2 doses, Mr. Speaker. And lockdowns are miserable. Lockdowns are appalling things to have to do, but I have to say that I believe that we had absolutely no choice.
Yes, Starmer.
OK, let's just jump in there, as we do here on Times Radio, pausing the action to try and unpack what's going on. Well, Nigel in Brecon, bang on.
God, yeah, Nigel in Brecon is probably a code name for Ben Nunner, another one of Keir Starmer's senior communications aides. I think that's a really interesting question and an even more interesting answer from Boris Johnson, because this isn't a single-sourced assertion. Basically, almost every newspaper and broadcaster has stood the piles of bodies comment up from numerous sources who were in Downing Street. And lots of people, you speak to Tory MPs, say, why would the Prime Minister lie? He has a habit of doing this. Why lie when the truth is so easily verifiable? And indeed, Keir Starmer was talking about evidence. Dominic Cummings is going to turn up in the Commons, we're led to believe, with a sheaf full of evidence for this and many other things on the 26th of May. And it's a pretty categorical denial. Since this Monday, when Downing Street first denied this to the Mail. Every other denial that's been forthcoming on this and other comments have been, this is a distortion. Michael Gove at the dispatch box basically said, oh, I couldn't imagine him saying that, rather than saying no. But that is straight down the line. It's as strong as a denial as you'll get from the Prime Minister. So I really don't understand the strategy here, if there is one.
And there are two things at play here in terms of what you can and can't say in the House of Commons. One is privilege, which is any MP can stand up in the House of Commons and basically say anything free from the possibility of prosecution or being sued, basically to stop them being cowed by malign forces from outside, which is potentially, what Keir Starmer could plead as a defence for putting forward these allegations. The other thing is misleading the House. And Boris Johnson there's no wriggle room at all in that. No, Mr. Speaker, I did not say that. And if it is later proven that he did in some way beyond off-the-record briefings, then that could land him in pretty hot water as well there. I mean, Boris Johnson has ever sort of managed to get from that claim to the merits of lockdowns, bitter disagreements, lockdowns are appalling and things to do, and then on to blowing the trumpet of vaccinations.
But also, I don't think the inquiry, when it comes, will conclude that second lockdown in October was a roaring success, because as soon as they took the brakes off, infections started to rise again, and then the Kent variant, it fails on its own terms. Yeah,
and all of the row, which is one that Dominic Cummings is going to rehearse, is that if he'd done it sooner, then it might have been more effective. Right, let's go back to the House of Commons then. Question 2 from Keir Starmer.
Well, somebody here isn't telling the truth. The House will have heard the Prime Minister's answer, and I remind him the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation." I'll leave it there for now. Turning to another issue, there'll be further on this, believe you me, who initially, and Prime Minister, initially is the key word here, who initially paid for the redecoration of his Downing Street flat?
This is the big question.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to misleading Parliament, he may recollect that it was only a few weeks ago that he said that he didn't oppose this government, this country staying in leaving the European Medicines Agency. The fact that he was then forced to retract and leaving the European Medicines Agency was absolutely invaluable for our vaccine rollout. And actually, it was just last week that he said that James Dyson. He said that James Dyson was a personal friend of mine. A fact that James Dyson was corrected in the newspaper this morning. As for the latest stuff that he's bringing up, he should know that I paid for Downing Street refurbishment personally, Mr. Speaker, and I contrast it. And any further declaration that I have to make, I will, if any, I will be advised upon by Lord Guide. But if he talks about housing costs, Mr. Speaker, then the people of this country can make their own decision in just 8 days' time, because on average Labour councils charge you £93 more in Band D, the Conservative councils, and Liberal Democrat councils charge you £120 more. That, I think, is the issue. That, I think, is the issue upon which the British people would like him to focus.
Wow. I mean, who paid initially for your flat refurbishment? To get from that to how much a Lib Dem council will cost you in your Band D council tax?
I mean, but that is fundamentally the calculation that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party are making, which is people actually really don't particularly care, which might be true for better or worse. People might shrug their shoulders and say, he's the Prime Minister, what's 58 grand, and if he's paid, what's the issue? But as a response to legitimate and necessary lines of inquiry in Parliament. I mean, I hope he's not going to say that to the Electoral Commission, who have just launched their probe. And given that we know that there's a reason the Conservative Party are speaking in the present tense, and Cabinet Ministers saying no party funds are being used, like Bill Clinton saying it depends what the meaning of the word is. It's again, I don't understand why. It's really, really hard to get a handle on why the Prime Minister is getting up in Parliament and saying these things that may well be disproved in a few days' time.
And the reason this matters, and lots of people say, I don't care, there are other things going on in the world. The reason it matters is because we should know who is lending money to senior politicians. Because if we know, we might at least be able to join the dots into what they might have got for it. And, not in any way commenting on this, but were someone to lend the Prime Minister £100,000, you'd want to know that they were doing that, so then you could check, did they then get some contracts? Did they get some preferential treatment or whatever from the government? And the question is, the reason that this is so pertinent is because it seems like, as far as we can ascertain, the work was done, the bill was paid, and Boris Johnson has paid either the Tory party or a Tory donor back for that money, probably because questions were being asked about it, and not just because, he couldn't find his checkbook. So let's go back to, just as all that's the background of all of it. I suspect that Keir Starmer might just have another go with the same question. Let's go back to the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, normally when people don't want to incriminate themselves, they go no comment. Let me ask this. Let's explore this a bit further, Prime Minister. Let's ask it a different way. Either, this is the initial invoice, Prime Minister, initial invoice, either the taxpayer paid the initial invoice, or it was the Conservative Party, or it was a private donor, or it was the Prime Minister. So I'm making it easy for the Prime Minister. It's now multiple choice. There are only 4 options. It should be easier than finding the chatty rat, Mr. Speaker. So I ask the Prime Minister again, who paid the initial invoice, Prime Minister, for the redecoration of the Prime Minister's flat? The initial invoice.
Right, so it's the same question. Here we go.
Mr. Speaker, I've given him the answer, and the answer is I have covered the costs, and I think most people will find it absolutely bizarre. And, of course, there's an Electoral Commission investigating this, and I can tell him that I've conformed in full with the Code of Conduct, with ministerial code, and officials who have been have been advising me throughout this whole thing. But I think people will think it absolutely bizarre that he is focusing on this issue. When what people want to know is what plans the Labour government might have to improve the life of people in this country. And let me tell you, if he talks about housing again, we're helping people on the house. I'd rather not spend taxpayers' money, by the way, like the last Labour government, who spent £500,000 of taxpayers' money on the Downing Street flat. I'd rather, yes, they did, tarting it up. I would much rather help people get on the property ladder, and it's this Conservative government that has built 244,000 homes in the last year, which is a record over 30 years. This is a government that gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, while he continually raises, I think, issues that most people would find irrelevant to their concerns.
I mean, if your defence is nobody cares about this, you're on some slight... I mean, actually, to be fair, Boris Johnson made a series of statements there which are going to be really picked over. I conformed with the Code of Conduct and the Ministerial Code. Officials have been advising me throughout on this. I assume that includes Simon Case, who managed to appear in front of MPs on Monday and say nothing. And the defence that the Labour Party spends a lot of money when in government tarting it up. A quick bit of math suggests about £30,000 a year, which is actually about half what Boris Johnson has just spent on it. But still no closer to getting to the bottom of this question of and there is clearly a gap in between what Boris Johnson is saying and the question that Keir Starmer is asking.
Yeah, he's just not engaging with the question, as is the case when any Conservative minister appears on broadcast. And no matter how hard any interviewer tries, they just won't shift from this line that Boris Johnson has paid. You can't get a more direct question than the one Keir Starmer just asked. And the Prime Minister said an awful lot there. As you said, peppered his answer with claims of propriety and abidance to codes. But really, I wouldn't surprise me if Keir Starmer just kept asking that same question again and again and again.
Yeah, you may well be right. A reminder that this morning the Electoral Commission, which is the watchdog for all of these things, says they've been in contact with the Conservative Party since late March and have conducted an assessment of the information they've provided to us. We are now satisfied there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. We'll therefore continue this work as a formal investigation to establish whether this is the case. So the Electoral Commission is not entirely satisfied that it's all above board. This is PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. We pause the action live in the House of Commons to try and explain what is going on. Let's go back to the House of Commons. Question 4 from Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he talks of priorities. What's he spending his time doing? This is a Prime Minister who, during the pandemic, was nipping out of meetings to choose wallpaper at £840 a roll. Just last week, he spent his time phoning journalists to moan about his old friend Dominic Cummings. And he's telling the civil service to find out who paid for the redecoration in his flat. The Cabinet Secretary has been asked to investigate who paid for the refurbishments in the flat. Why doesn't the Prime Minister just tell him? That would be the end of the investigation. Mr. Speaker, it's been widely reported that Lord Brownlow, who just happens to have been given a peerage by the Conservative Party, was asked to donate £58,000 to help repay for the cost of this refurbishment. Can the Prime Minister, if he's so keen to answer, confirm, did Lord Brownlow make that payment for that purpose?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've answered this question several times now, and the answer is that I have covered the costs. I have met the requirements that I've been obliged to meet in full.
It's fair to say there is a smirk on Boris Johnson's face.
When it comes to the taxpayer and the costs of Number 10 Downing Street, it was the previous Labour government. I think Tony Blair racked up a bill of £350,000. And I think what the people of this country want to see is minimising taxpayer expense. They want to see a government that's focused on their needs and delivering more homes for the people of this country and cutting council tax, which is what we're doing. And it's on that basis that I think people are going to judge our parties on May the 6th.
Obviously, looking ahead to the local elections again there. I mean, if there's one thing that Boris Johnson hasn't done at all this morning is answer the question of did Lord Brownlow pay for his refurb?
Yeah, look, and I think, there is Keir Starmer wasn't actually a prosecution barrister, he was a defence barrister, but he more than made up for that in his time at the DPP, and he's building a very strong case against Boris Johnson here, I think. I think the crucial line earlier in the exchange was you say no comment when you don't want to incriminate yourself. And Boris Johnson has offered plenty of comment here, but crucially, not on the question of whether Lord Brownlow paid for his flat, which seems to be one of those, as people in Belfast used to say about a certain allegation about Jerry Adams. Even the dogs in the street know that Lord Brownlow allegedly paid for this flat, and Boris Johnson just doesn't seem to want to acknowledge it.
It's really interesting. We're getting lots of messages coming in. Boris Johnson's a pathological kicker of cans down the road. Always in denial, says David in Croydon. Jenny says Boris Johnson sounds like a petulant, guilty child. Denial and obfuscation. Someone else pointing out Peter Mandelson. Didn't Peter Mandelson resign as a minister because of an undeclared loan to help buy a house? And that's why this matters. And
our colleague Henry Zeffman pointed out that this was circulated by the Tories in an internal briefing paper for when if a Tory MP is going on their local radio station, they're asked about this, they just say, well, Peter Mandelson had to do X, Y, Z for an undeclared loan. And, as ever, attack lines always come back to bite a party.
Yeah, so let's see if where Keir Starmer goes. Question number 5, I think, now from the Labour leader.
Starmer.
Answer the question. That's what the public scream at their televisions every PMQs. Answer the question. The Prime Minister hasn't answered the question. He knows he hasn't answered the question. He never answers the question. The Prime Minister will be aware that he's required to declare any benefits that relate to his political activities, including loans or credit arrangements, within 28 days. 28 days, Prime Minister, yes. He will also know that any donation must be recorded in the register of ministers' interests, and that under the law any donation of over £500 to a political party must be registered and declared. So the rules are very clear. The Electoral Commission now think that there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have occurred. That's incredibly serious. Can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he believe that any rules or laws have been broken in relation to the refurbishment of the Prime Minister's flat?
We can probably guess at the answer to this. This is Boris Johnson.
No, I don't, Mr. Speaker. What I believe has been strained to breaking point is the credulity of the public. He has half an hour every week to put serious and sensible questions to me about the state of the pandemic, about the vaccine rollout, about what we're doing to support our NHS, about what we're doing to fight crime, about what we're doing to bounce back from this pandemic, about the economic recovery, about jobs for the people of this country. And he goes on and on, Mr. Speaker, about wallpaper when, as I've told him umpteen times now, I paid for it.
Keir Starmer's face, quite the picture there, distinctly unimpressed.
Yeah, and look, clearly, he is talking to a man who has decided, as the Conservative Party as an entity has decided, not to engage with the question that's being asked. And the political calculation there, distinct from the calculations about process and the questions they'll have to answer to the Electoral Commission and the Standards Commission and others, is that voters will not care. But there is a question here about whether it's worth the Prime Minister's while to burn up a lot of political capital batting away questions that could straightforwardly be answered. Now. Yes, it'll be painful to do so, but it's the cover-up that always does for you. And whatever issue arises from this will be much, much bigger if it happens because of the obfuscation, because of the delay, and frankly, because of the impression that had the Daily Mail not been leaked the salient details here, we wouldn't be any the wiser.
Yeah, we wouldn't know that what was going on. We wouldn't know quite how gaudy the wallpaper might be, allegedly. Okay, Matt Chorley with you on Times Radio, doing PMQs Unpacked with Patrick Maguire, Red Box editor. Right, we can go back then. Let's see how we've not got very far in his line of duty style interrogation. Let's get the last question from Keir Starmer. Does he get anywhere with his peroration?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I remind the Prime Minister of the Nolan Principles, which are meant to govern the behaviour of those in public office? They're these: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Instead, what do we get from this Prime Minister and this Conservative government? Dodgy contracts, jobs for their mates, and cash for access. And who's at the heart of it? The Prime Minister, Major Sleaze, sitting there. Mr. Speaker, meanwhile, he talks about priorities. Crime is going up. NHS waiting lists are at record levels, and millions of people are worried about their jobs, including Liberty Steel. Mr. Speaker, don't the British people deserve a Prime Minister they can trust and a government that isn't mired in sleaze, cronyism and scandal?
Mr. Speaker, last week he came to this chamber and he attacked me for talking to James Dyson about ventilators, where we're now sending ventilators to help the people of India. And the following day, Mr. Speaker, the Labour front bench said that any Prime Minister in my position would have done exactly the same thing. It wasn't only a few months ago that they were actually attacking Kate Bingham, saying she was a crony when she helped to set up the vaccine task force that delivered millions of vaccines for the people of this country, Mr. Speaker, and helping us to get out of the pandemic. This is a government that is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities. We're rolling out many more nurses, 10,000 more nurses in the NHS now than there were this time last year, 8,771 more police officers on our streets now than there were when I was elected, including tougher sentences, Mr. Speaker, for serious sexual and violent criminals, which he opposed, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on. And by the way, I forgot to mention it. Last night, our friends in the European Union voted to approve our Brexit deal, which he opposed, which enables us not just to take back control of our borders, Mr. Speaker, but to deliver free, which it does, which he fervently opposed, enabling us, amongst other things, to deal with such threats as the European Super League, Mr. Speaker, but it enables us to deliver free ports in places like Teesside, and above all, taking back control of our country has allowed us to deliver the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, as he well knows, Mr. Speaker, which would not have been possible if we'd stayed in the European Medicines Agency, which he voted for. Mr. Speaker, week after week, the people of this country can see the difference between a Labour Party that twists and turns with the wind, that thinks of nothing except playing political games, whereas this party gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, and I hope that people will vote Conservative on May the 6th.
Well, I mean, we'll come on to the content in a moment, but having watched Boris Johnson do all of his PMQs since he became Prime Minister, that's the angriest I've seen him.
I've not seen him that rattled since the 2019, the period immediately preceding the election in 2019, the days of dead in a ditch and humbug, when Brexit was at its most febrile and ill-tempered. That is not a Boris Johnson we often see at the dispatch box.
He was pointy and shouty and getting a bit red in the face and looked properly... I mean, as a result, we got the full sort of Boris Johnson greatest hits, everything from free ports to the European Super League and everything in between.
Yeah, and look, that is Boris Johnson's potted electoral offer. I think it's... reading between the lines, or a close analysis of both their questions, you had Starmer talking about Liberty Steel, which is a big employer in Hartlepool. Then you had Boris Johnson talking about free ports and creating jobs on Teesside. Really, actually, this whole exchange is in a microcosm how each party would like the Hartlepool by-election campaign, which comes to a head next Thursday when voters go to the polls, and all the other elections, how they'd like it to play out. Labour are saying this is your opportunity to cast judgment on a government that is too busy serving its cronies and feathering its own nest, quite literally in this case, with very fancy wallpaper.
With potentially actual feather. I don't think we should rule out the possibility there might be actual feathers involved.
Well, I imagine they've got lovely goose down pillows. But anyway, and then Boris Johnson on the other side saying, actually, well, what's a little bit of, whatever between mates, and look at me delivering on your actual priorities where Keir Starmer is carping in Westminster. And look, it might be too soon next Thursday to make a judgment on that, but we'll see. It's clearly a theme Labour want to hammer away at, because that's the point of vulnerability, they think, with Boris Johnson and his voters. The charge that they're the same old Tories.
Yeah, we should point out that Keir Starmer is reading out the Nolan principles, as he described them: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty and leadership. They've been around since the mid-90s. They're named after Lord Nolan, Michael Nolan, not the
sisters.
Not the sisters. Although I'm sure they do also live up to all of those.
Yeah, that's actually, the 6 Nolan sisters are honesty, integrity. Lovely Irish names, anyway.
And in terms of, you're right, because the political, it feels like we could be slightly trapped, sorry listeners, but we could be slightly trapped in this political row until next Thursday. Because this big set of elections happening in Wales, Scotland, and then across much of England, lots of council seats up, some big mayoral contests. The Tees Valley one is in particular, as you just touched on. And then, of course, Hartlepool. And actually, were Boris Johnson to win Tees Valley mayoral and potentially Hartlepool, would that change this political conversation?
Very good question. I don't imagine so, because Labour are hammering away at this, not just because it's politically expedient, but because they think it raises serious questions of propriety about the Prime Minister. But nor, if Boris Johnson wins a swathe of mayoralties and Hartlepool, basically, these rounds are resolved more quickly when there is political pressure on the Prime Minister to do so. There is no Conservative, unless something's happened while we've been talking, no Conservative MP, I think, is going to get up and do anything that hastens the demise of their big election winner. Now, actually, if it's proven to hurt the Prime Minister at the polls, then maybe you'll see some unease building saying, look, we threw away a fortnight before local elections in which we could have made a really big splash and staked our claim to be, truly the people's government and win seats we never had before. But, we'll see.
I suppose, actually, the gamble then, were Labour to lose Hartlepool, one of the few potentially red wall seats that they've managed to hold on to last time, you could see the conversation turn quite quickly into Keir Starmer's future, which could massively change things. Tony has just been in touch, listening in, saying Boris Johnson is right to think voters don't care about honesty. Nobody would vote for Boris Johnson if honesty was important to them. I did actually earlier in the week take out the YouGov polling. Nobody trusted Boris Johnson when he... trustworthiness was not high on the agenda when he won in 2019.
Yeah, and an old sage, an old lobby sage, I think it was John Rentoul, and even if it wasn't, he'd know this anyway, of The Independent, said Neil Kinnock was consistently polled as more honest than Thatcher. And obviously we know how that ended.
So we'll see. Yeah, but although we should stress that just because it doesn't necessarily decide elections, it would be nice if our politicians told the truth and had a degree of honesty. That would just be good for everyone, I think.